ARE podcast, episode number 9.
Welcome to the ARE podcast. Where it's all about encouraging and inspiring you today so you can fulfill your dream of becoming a licensed architect tomorrow. And now your host. He's run 3 marathons for a combined time of 13 hours, 51 minutes. David Doucette.
Hello, and welcome to another exciting and action-packed episode here of the ARE podcast. And we have a full house today as we are going to talk about what is a licensed architect. Joining us are authors Stephen Hopkins and Brandon Kent, who wrote an article about Daniel Libeskind. We're going to dive into that. And also, Evan Troxel, who is the host or one of the hosts of ArchiSpeak podcast. So if you haven't already checked that podcast out, definitely do it. Check ours out first, then you can head over and check out Evan's.
Fair enough.
Guys, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I think we got a good topic of discussion here. Before we kind of jump into Stephen and Brandon's article, what I want to do is just kind of lay the ground rules of sort of what's happening here in our discussion. And there's really 2 main things. There's the use of the title of architect for actually legally providing architectural services. And then there is the title of architect, which is used in the media and has more to deal with the perception of what an architect does, which is more how Stephen and Brandon's article is geared towards. So the first thing I want to do is just lay out briefly the legality of what a licensed architect is, and this is applicable to how it works here in the United States. So what happens is each state licenses the architect to practice architecture in the state. So it's on a state-by-state basis. So if I'm licensed in California, I cannot go practice in New Mexico, for example, unless the state of New Mexico has licensed me to practice there. So it's on a state-by-state basis, and depending on what the department in each state is called, here in California, it's the California Architects Board, and they actually have the Architects Practice Act, and they are very clear on who can use the term architect, who cannot, in terms of providing architectural services. For example, here in California, we can't call ourselves an architect or use architectural or in any way confuse the public of providing architectural services if we're not, in fact, a licensed architect. So other states will have sort of similar language, so I recommend you contact your local state or your state architecture board to find out how exactly it applies to you. So that's sort of the legality of it. It's the states that determine who's practicing in their own state. So let's jump into the article, Brandon and Stephen, that you wrote called Daniel Libeskind is no architect. I know this became I think this grew out of a LinkedIn discussion. So, Stephen, what prompted you to say, I got to write an article about this?
Yeah, I think it definitely grew. Well, first off, thanks for having us, David. I appreciate it and happy to join. It grew out of a discussion that's happened on the AIA's national LinkedIn group. And I forget exactly what it was called, but it was essentially something along the lines of misrepresenting oneself as an architect. And that got, well, I think that topic's been discussed ad nauseum. But the interesting thing to me, or at least the difference of opinion for me, was that the group discussion had, at the time, I think, almost 200 posts on it, or 200 comments on it. And if you look through most of the commentary on that LinkedIn group, there is little to no commentary, and so it clearly sparks an interest with the group. And a lot of the commentary was around, the word, sort of based around the argument that, it's really hard to get licensed, and so we have to protect it, which I think you'll find both Brandon and I respect that argument, although it's not exactly what we're talking about. So we see that on there, and then my career sort of deviated from architecture a little bit, and so I was at IDSA's national conference a couple weeks after that, and Industrial Design Society of America, and their chairman was talking about a much different model of design. And he spoke to everyone being a member of the IDSA, some paid, meaning everyone is sort of a part of our design community, interacts with the work we do, but some are just more active members. And that got Brandon and I thinking about how we culturally as architects want to protect the word and have a very inclusive view of our professional title, and wondering if there isn't something different out there, or have a little broader discussion about that word.
And for those, we're recording this, it's on YouTube, but for those just listening to audio, the description under your name, Stephen, is recovering architect. So you are a licensed architect who is recovering. Probably a few of us can relate to that. Yeah,
we'll never fully recover, I'm certain, but no longer practicing.
And Evan, I invited you on because you're the host of the ArchiSpeak podcast. I know you guys talked about this last fall. I know you're on your own personal journey to become a licensed architect.
Right.
How did the conversation go when you guys talked about it in your podcast?
I try to forget those conversations as soon as we have them, but typically, I think the argument or the conversation that happens, everybody, I think, is pretty much in agreement that there needs to be some way to differentiate who is an architect and who is not. And so I can, again, just like everybody, I think, is thinking, there's got to be some way to say you're a licensed architect or you're not. But as far as the services that people are providing, I mean, firms are full of people who are not licensed architects who are actually doing the work, and they're also full of people who are licensed architects who are completely disconnected from doing the work. And I think a lot of times, especially in larger firms, that comes up a lot with the younger staff, who aren't getting the mentorship that they need from architects, and maybe that's part of what's going on with this is you've got people who are very much in the trenches and not feeling like the people who are licensed are bringing them up in the ways of architecture. That was definitely something that we talked about. And there's two of us on the podcast who are not licensed or in the process, and one who is. And so, there definitely is a rite of passage. I mean, I think I have issues with the way that they're doing that today, with the way that the testing is actually working as far as the process that people are going through and the anonymity of it. That's maybe something else we could talk about. But so I guess that the overarching thing is that, it seems to make sense that there needs to be some protection, but at the same time, I think people know what you're talking about when you say you're an architect, or if you say you're something else that has the word architect in the title.
Let me ask you, Brandon, because it seemed to be, at least reading your article, Brandon, that you guys were more for a looser interpretation of the term architect, or the term architect should apply to maybe more people or not be as controlled. So is the term, I guess my question to you, Brandon, is the term architect misused?
Again, like Stephen said, thank you for having us on. I think that what we were arguing is not really use or misuse, but really about whether it really matters to some extent. In that, in the design world, you see, I think, an expansive and ever accessible kind of design environment, and when you look at it in kind of insular kind of profession like architecture, you see that the word sometimes gets in the way of being able to, it limits perhaps what you might be able to engage with in the global community. And so I think that what Stephen and I were trying to say was that we shouldn't allow the terminology and the terminology or the title to get in the way of what the aspirational goal is for what an architect is. So the protection and the life safety requirements and the legality side of things, we feel is less the argument and more about this need for relevance within the world. That's why people are reacting the way they are. And so we feel like if the profession were to open up and be more expansive, that the term would become less meaningful to the profession, but we'd also be able to have the ability to affect more things in the world, and we'd allow more things to affect us. And that would be good for many reasons, meaning that we could then have a greater effect of change on a global scale versus just our one part of the puzzle.
And Stephen, let me ask you, the article or the title of your article is Daniel Libeskind is no architect, which I know grew out of the conversation essentially in England. Explain that title, because before you do, just in my mind, the way my mind goes to this is, okay, is he licensed? And of course we do a search, and he is licensed in New York. But obviously that wasn't the point of the article, because it was a hot topic basically in England. So Stephen, explain the title of the article.
Sure. The funny thing is the title probably happened, and I don't know, Brandon, you can vouch for this. I think probably happened within the last hour of publishing, and was actually, I'd say, 90 to 95% driven by the editor. And so we had a working title. BK, I don't even remember what it was. Maybe it was an argument for the embrace of a larger context around the word architecture, or definition of architecture. There you go. And we had a couple quick little email discussions with the editor afterwards, and this proved to be much more conducive to discussion. And so that's the way that went. And oddly enough, we have, and nothing's come of it, thankfully, but been, the editor and us included, been contacted by Daniel Liebeskind's office and his PR firm, and not the friendliest manner.
Nice. You're making waves. Well, I mean, that's part of what this is about, though, right? And Eric, this grew out of the article, if you have that sort of with you, or where they were talking about basically I believe it was the London-based Architects Registration Board, because Libeskind's not licensed to practice there, and they contacted the magazine to basically stop referring to them as an architect.
Yeah, exactly. But it brings up a bigger issue, which is that at a time when the world needs our type of problem solving and our type of thinking, should we as a profession really be getting bent out of shape over it? Because here's the truth of it. There is a difference between, some guy who's handy, who's never gone to school for architecture, who's out there, trying to build something illegally, versus someone who's licensed in at least one state somewhere in the world and doing it in other places, right? There is this, I don't want to say double standard, but essentially there's two different types of unlicensed individuals. I'm licensed in 3 states right now, just because I am. But if I ever wanted to build something in Utah, would I get into trouble because I'd be hanging myself out as a licensed architect there, even though I'm not licensed in that state?
Yes, you would.
Yeah, and I would. I would. But that's
right.
But that's, first of all, it's patently ridiculous, because first of all, I wouldn't put my California stamp on a set of plans I submit to Utah. I'd probably find a local firm that is licensed. I'd joint venture with them, and that's the reality of it. That's what Liebeskind's doing in a way, right? he's licensed in New York, but if he were to do a project anywhere else in the U.S., I know for a fact he'd hire some local firm and they'd be architect of record for it. So we have this crazy standard, and at the same time that we're trying to control this name architect, we also have the software industry where virtually every job posting they have is solutions architect, database architect, software architect. It's kind of ridiculous, and nobody's controlling that. So in the UK, they have one national registration, which is probably not a bad idea for something that we could potentially do here in the States.
And let me ask you this, because one of the comments, which the comments sometimes, the articles are interesting, of course, but obviously the comments are interesting too, because people get heated about this. And I want to read this one comment from Russ Watson, AIA, talking about who gets to use the term architect. And he says, call it what you may, but professional branding or licensing of doctors, lawyers, accountants, engineers, architects, airline pilots, and ship captains and the like serves as a necessary and important function in civilized societies. Without it, we live in a sideshow of pseudo-professional chaos. When I go in for heart surgery, it's the confidence that my surgeon is in fact a licensed and therefore a qualified heart surgeon, not someone who fancies the title. So I think we could probably agree with that rationalization. But what I'm getting from Brandon and Stephen's article is that it sounds like you guys want a broader use of the term architect. Am I reading that right?
I don't know that we want or care even about a broader use. I think the articles and the sort of context and our thoughts stem from why the interest we have and why we care so much about the use of the word. And so to me personally, it doesn't matter to me. I'm not bothered. I'm not fooled even when software architects use the word, when anyone in the profession uses the word itself, but we as a profession generally seems so wrapped up in protecting the idea, and I completely understand the rationale that was just given in that comment, but I'd also say we've completely failed. If that is the judge by which we are, or the standard by which we're holding ourselves, that ship has sailed. I mean, yeah. We've totally lost that notion.
Evan, what do you think here?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I think that's what Eric's saying too. It's like, why are we wasting? To some extent, yeah, it's a valiant pursuit, but it's way too late is what I'm hearing, and that's kind of how I feel too. It's such a wide use thing, and we're hanging on so tight, or professionals are hanging on so tight. It's like, go out and solve more pressing issues than this one. This is something that you're never going to get back.
Yeah, Evan, I completely agree. And I have a bit of a unique perspective in that I've at least once removed from the day-to-day of the profession, and from this perspective, I see a massive value that the community, the education, the professional experience provides to the world. I don't think, Brandon and I are in no ways debating that. I think the skills and tools we have are massively valuable. I think we completely limit ourselves by the way we are desperately trying to hold on to and protect this minor usage of the word, when the world and our community and how they perceive us and see the word architect and design generally is totally different. And in some ways, it's as simple as just a shift of thinking.
Yeah. So Brandon, let me ask you this, and I want you guys, other guys, to think about this too. So who is bickering more about the use of the term architect? Who is mad more? Is it the licensed architects, or is it the unlicensed architects? And by unlicensed architects, I'm thinking mainly the individuals who have put a lot of time into the profession, that for all intents and purposes, they might be licensed, but for whatever reason with NCARB and the licensing process here in the States, they're as qualified as anybody, but they just, can't get through that final hoop. So who is more agitated about this term architect? What do you say, Brandon?
In reality, it's probably to some degree split, but I will say that I think that primarily the argument comes from the license side. And I think it's because that licensure is not easy to get, and we all understand that. I'm in the process of doing it myself, and still have the California supplemental exam, which is kind of unique to California, which is part of a frustrating process and in its own right. But so I would say that, licensed architects see this as being something that's very important to protect and hold close to them. It gives them meaning, and in some ways it's nostalgically placed in that they're connected to the past of what architecture was, which was this greater idea of the great innovators and designers of the world. And now that that's opened up a little bit, and we have industrial designers and things like the Adobe suite have made graphic design available to others, and 3D printing and other things. I think that nostalgia and that ownership of design and great thinking and innovation is feeling threatened, especially by those that work so hard to gain that licensure, and they see it as a status symbol somewhat that needs to be protected. Unlicensed architects, I believe, in some cases, like myself, I see value in gaining the licensure, but I don't necessarily feel like it's the stamp on my career that I need to really make myself known to the world as being a designer or innovator or architect. It's more of kind of being a part of the process that perhaps in my own career I might want to utilize that to my advantage versus having that title. So to me, it's definitely it seems to be kind of something that is protected by the licensed architects.
Eric, let me throw this one at you because I'm thinking, or the ones that I read, the people who are most upset about it seem to be, at least from the stuff I've been reading, it's the people who have the experience but just haven't been, for whatever reason, been able to get the license, and they're sort of mad, and maybe rightly so. But Eric, let me ask you this. As a licensed architect, I mean, from a purely business standpoint, forgetting about doing great things, as a purely business standpoint to, put food on the table, should we as architects, should we be protecting our business from, essentially unlicensed individuals, coming into our soup kitchen and feeding off of what is our work? What do you think?
Our soup kitchen and our barely profitable work. Should we? Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's our job. I think like most people, I like I love getting the California Architects newsletter, and getting the description of all their what are the enforcement actions. That's right. Always the most popular thing. And the one that, well, he's been working in a firm for 18 years, and he inadvertently was referred to as an architect on a website, and they busted him and fined him $500. To me, that seems a waste of resources. But the ones that I enjoy are when they say, yeah, this guy who wasn't even a licensed contractor built a 4-story building, invented a stamp and made up a number and stamped these like that. That's a crime. To me, that's nuts, because you could kill people. To me, that's different. I think that there's two different standards there. But in the Architects Board's eyes, especially California, which is one of the most stringent, they're really tough on any use of that word.
Well, there and I mean,
even architectural designer is even controlled by them here in the state, and a lot of the time I feel like most of the reason why I'm licensed is just so they leave me alone.
Yeah.
Well, and their main purpose is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their public. I mean, at the core, that's what they do, and then they also regulate the practice of architecture. But some of us here work in sort of the residential world, and the residential world is where you can encounter a lot of, let's say, competition from unlicensed individuals, and from what I've seen is some of that is basically unlicensed individuals can essentially do projects cheaper because they don't have all the stuff that goes with sort of a real office and some that licensed architects. I mean, I think that is a legitimate concern from the licensed architect standpoint that somebody else can do something cheaper. Stephen, what do you make of that as sort of the recovering architect? Like basically competition with these unlicensed individuals?
Well, I mean, so I also have a business degree, and I would say that if the world is telling you that the value is the same and they are providing at a cheaper price, then I don't know, that's kind of the world we live in, right? I think we just have to be cognizant of the value we provide. And, you know, going back to some of the earlier conversation about, I think, protecting our soup kitchen idea, I think in some ways by that sort of thinking is also, it can be myopic in that you assume a zero-sum game, meaning that there's no bigger pie out there for us. And being, again, a step removed, I don't think that's true at all. I think there is a lot of value that architects can provide outside of the traditional sort of scope we see, and I'm daily living proof of that. But by sort of turning inward so much and sort of trying to put up the walls, we limit our thinking around that. Yeah.
You're kind of too busy protecting your soup kitchen and not thinking about whether the soup kitchen could have a bakery side or have other components to what you end up providing as the ingredients to a healthy business. So if there are components about what we do that are touchable by the layperson, I don't see that necessarily as a bad thing. I mean, I think we should welcome what other disciplines or people or lines of thought could bring to how we improve our process too, and how maybe we do things a little differently. And those are, I think those things definitely exist. Because David, you probably live them more than I do because I work in a larger firm and we don't really operate at that level. The competition comes at, you know, what's your differentiator in your resume and how many of hospitals have you done, and to that extent, which is, you know, a whole different discussion about whether that's a broken system in its own right. But I think that if I agree with Stephen in that regard, that part of, you know, what we've done in a larger context is try and leverage our ability to think about design in many different aspects. So whether that's consulting as far as understanding problems with universities and their business and trying to help them understand design thinking from that standpoint, and talking with you know, leadership levels at places like that to help them understand the problem at its root and core versus just providing them a built solution, is becoming part of what we offer as a service, part of what we do. And having that holistic thought around a company's or an institution or even a family's organization or thoughts, and where the problems and issues resolve, and then creating solutions for that, I think can help us steer our profession in a direction that solves greater problems, but doesn't just provide a reaction to a program and a site.
I mean, the massive, piggybacking on that, the massively frustrating thing for me is that I can't remember a time, at least in my lifetime, that design has been more valued than it is now. I think people understand the value of the design, and whether that's from the pen I'm holding to the city we live in, I think we all collectively are appreciating it more. And in some ways, by, you know, running back to this health, safety, welfare issue, we fail to embrace that in the built environment, that design is actually worth a lot. And I think that part of this conversation is frustrating to me, just seeing our inability to sort of own that part of it, or that part of the conversation.
It sounds like from what I'm hearing from both of you and what I'm picking up, it's you guys are operating really from a sense of abundance. Like there's a lot of cool stuff we as an architecture community can do. Rather than the flip side of that is operating from a space of scarcity, which may be the architects who feel that their licensing is being threatened by unlicensed individuals. Obviously, they're not operating from abundance; they're operating from scarcity, which can be a limiting belief.
Sure. I mean, and that goes back to my confidence, I suppose, in the value of our professional experience and our education. There is no doubt in my mind that there is value there, and you can go find it. It's not that it's out there a lot of different places, and I think it's just a little myopic to think that, well, I can only do these things, and so I've got to protect these things that are traditional to my profession.
Yeah, and the other thing about this is that architects shouldn't just be worried about an unlicensed professional taking away their work, but there's plenty of licensed professionals who are willing to do it for less than you. And you're competing again. The field is much bigger than unlicensed people.
And
Sure.
I think competition is a healthy thing for anybody, because it's going to make everybody better at what they do. And yeah, I think if those sort of licensed architects are threatened by their those unlicensed individuals, then that licensed architect has to step up their game, and it's going to make a better product for everybody. There's this quote from your article, the presumed erosion, and I'm going to throw this one to you, Evan. The presumed erosion of the stature of the word architect is, at its root, pure paranoia. Architects of buildings, you specify here, are now struggling to hold on to their identity as the words designer and architect become more expansive and more accepted in new uses. So it sounds like it's a doomed fight there. What do you make of this, Evan?
Yeah, I think paranoia is the right word, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about you got to kind of pick your battles and see if this one's even worth fighting anymore. And I think what you were just saying, David, is how are you going to add even more value to the services that you already offer so that you can feel confident in what you're doing, so that you can feel confident that someone choosing you to do the work is making the right choice. I mean, I wouldn't mind if every single architect out there raised their fees. Everybody. I mean, and make the profession more valuable. Make it cost more for a reason. I mean, the stuff that we do adds tons of value to the world. And so constantly being concerned about people using the name, people charging less, there's always going to be somebody who's going to charge less, and you can go ahead and lead that race to the bottom if you want. But somebody's going to win, and most likely that person is going to be an unlicensed person who doesn't have the overhead, doesn't have the expertise, doesn't add the value, but they're dragging lots of people who do have those things down with them because they're the ones willing to engage in this. That's a scary thought, I think.
I want to talk about this next quote, hidebound thinking, which I think is an interesting concept. Hidebound thinking is threatening our meaning and even our existence in the market. So, Stephen, what is hidebound thinking?
Yeah, that's actually, this is largely Brandon's paragraph, so I'm gonna let him take this.
Okay, let's throw it over to Brandon.
Hidebound thinking is, it's kind of like a narrow focus or narrow viewpoint, and in looking at a profession, it's looking at how our discourse has become a little bit destructive and how we're not evolving with the way that the world works. So as our focal point becomes narrower and narrower about how we look at issues and how we view our profession, the rest of the world is opening up and becoming more accepting of being able to do more. So instead of becoming kind of nostalgic about those things and about what we were, we need to think about what we're going to be and what we can be. Yeah. And so, contractors did this really great, I think, maybe a few decades ago as they started to grab more scope in the way that they looked at their business and providing things like pre-construction services and doing things like that. And so I think that as we give away more of what we do from a technical standpoint or even from a construction standpoint, there's a whole lot of this soft area that we're leaving untouched. And so as we entrench ourselves into this thinking about how important it is to keep our role as it is, or is the way it's perceived in our own minds, not necessarily the world's perception of who architects are or designers are, we limit our ability to really move the profession forward. So we're kind of stuck in the past because we see the past as Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe and all of our great heroes. And as we kind of move off of that and become a society that has the accessibility of these things, we can't stay stuck.
So that makes sense to me, because then hidebound thinking is really operating. It's the same mindset of operating from a place of scarcity. So we're not moving forward. We're not improving. Let's see. Eric, chime in here.
If anything, the recession proved that there's plenty of competition among licensed architects when you had firms like Gensler and HOK underbidding and doing things below cost in order to squeeze out the little guy just to keep their staff busy. And as the owner of a small firm, I had to learn, firsthand that I would see on the RFP bidders list giant firms that normally they wouldn't even look twice at these little dinky projects, and now suddenly I was up against them. And also in a world where a contractor says to their client, you don't need an architect, I can finish it without them. You have engineers that are more than willing to take more responsibility and stamp drawings. And you have the AIA, which has been, really failing at proving the value of architects. And we've been pushing off responsibility and liability for the last 50 years. You can't then with a straight face say, no, we have to go after these people that are using the word architect because they're design. It's silly.
Yeah.
Well, and no one owes us anything.
Right.
There is nothing that says the construction model that we know has to exist a decade from now or 2 decades from now. We're not owed that. You have to continuously provide value or you quickly become irrelevant.
This also goes back to what Eric was saying earlier, where maybe we should be looking at more of a national licensing system, because look how far behind the software is, the testing practices. It's totally stuck in the past. And what really a state's boundary is, you don't even notice it when you drive over it, right? I mean, because everything is so global and so national now. It really does seem like there's a lot of thinking that's still being done in the past when it comes to our profession.
I'm glad you guys are mentioning this, because I'm thinking technology, number one. I just think, for whatever reason, for the most part, probably the architecture profession is probably one of the most technological, almost, I want to say illiterate in a sense.
Dinosaur, yeah.
Yeah, really, based on other professions.
I couldn't get the flag thing to work at all, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it's interesting that you guys write your article about this, which is not about technology, but it's almost about how architects essentially aren't moving forward because they're nitpicking on this idea of the use of the word architect. But technology, and I think we as architects, we want to do things the way they've always been done, and that just doesn't work in this decade for any profession.
I think it's very much in the same. It's this large institutional thinking where, even healthcare is still very reactionary instead of being proactive, and I think architecture is very similar, where we're constantly reacting to things, putting out fires. We're not spending that time doing the deep thinking to see, like you were saying earlier, where are we going to be? Where do we want to be? Let's design where we want to be and start moving toward that. Instead, we're constantly still thinking of how things have always been done. That's how we're going to keep on doing it, and that is pretty poisonous to our profession.
You certainly worry about, if and who knows who's right, but if you actually think there is a limited pool of projects, resource out there that we have to protect, how do you keep the top talent coming into this profession?
Yeah, what's attractive about it?
Yeah, that's a disaster. And so you will slowly see a degradation if we don't find ways to make the profession attractive to the best people. You can't blame them for going somewhere else.
So are you saying basically meaning that let's say the best people aren't coming into our profession because the act of licensure is so difficult, it's dissuading them?
No. Well, I'm not saying that. Now that you say it, I may agree with that. But I think what I'm saying is, if we continue to make ourselves less relevant by fighting petty battles, in my words, I think that we will continue to have a harder and harder time attracting the best talent into the profession.
So let me ask, and this is, I guess, for everybody. I guess just going back to the core basics, like doctors and lawyers, I mean, should architects be licensed to practice? And let's just keep it here in the States because it's easiest. But should architects be licensed, somewhere in the United States to practice in the United States? Eric, I'll throw that to you.
Absolutely, we should be licensed. From a health, safety, and welfare perspective, of course, we should be licensed. But also, we should do it with the understanding that we can show off to the public our value. I found that on my small projects, I have clients that are terminating the contract the moment I get them the permit.
Wow.
And when I say to them, but listen, we still have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of details to figure out, a lot of things to source. And there's, of course, all the construction administration stuff that I can do for you. Now I find that suddenly I'm on the defensive, and I'm having to explain to them how I'm processing contractors' release of liens, how I'm observing the work, how I'm protecting their interests. And they go, yeah, we'll be fine. Contractor's a nice guy. Right.
Evan, over.
And so I've had 5.
Go ahead, Eric.
Oh, I've had 5 projects in the last 18 months where they essentially say, yeah, you know what? Let's put a hold on the contract because you got us the permit. That's everything. That's all you're good for. In other words,
right, and I think residentially, and we're talking obviously residentially here, which residential, which is its own skill set, it's its own sort of animal. It's, I think, much different from sort of the rest of the field in terms of some of the stuff we're dealing with. So, Stephen, let me ask you, the recovering architect, should architects be licensed?
I think there is a fundamental need for licensure. So I think I'd probably agree with all of you that it is not a useless pursuit. I think the question, well, there's sort of 2 questions, and I'd be interested in your all's thought on the first one being, I'm not sure I provide more value because of my license. I think it's sort of part of the process, but I don't know that the license exactly tests the things that actually provide value to our clients. And that's probably a secondary discussion. I think the question for us has always been, and the permit is an interesting one, is that in some ways the way we're used to practicing, the fundamental model is broken. And so we sort of failed to embrace even design build a lot of. You see that, and so how can we rethink where we are, what we provide, how we deliver to add more value to our clients? I don't think we're ever going to get to a point that licensure is completely out of the mix. And certainly, I think it's necessary, but I think a rethinking of how we deliver projects is definitely in order.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that because obviously attorneys are licensed, doctors are licensed. Just because you have a license doesn't mean you're necessarily good. I mean, we've all watched Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul. I mean, he was licensed in New Mexico, right?
I am the poster child for that. I am.
Better Call Saul?
No, not for that. By every professional standard regulation, I can go build you a building, at least in this state, and could quickly get in a lot of other states, and would be perfectly under the law to do so. You'd be a crazy person to have me build you a building. I have not nearly the experience you all do. I don't have both, professionally and sort of, through the work I've been doing. It's just, I shouldn't be building people buildings, but by, every statute, I'm totally qualified. And maybe I'll feel the same way about the test, maybe not. I don't know, but that's at least my personal viewpoint.
Okay. Evan, should we be licensed?
Yes, we definitely should be licensed for all the reasons that have already been stated. But there needs to be some serious rethinking about how that's happening. I think that the system there, talk about broken systems, that's a big one. It's antiquated. It's ancient. It's not, most of the material on there isn't even relevant to the way most people practice.
And Brandon, who's just picked us back up, we were talking about no worries. The big question about should architects be licensed. So I'm going to throw that to you now.
Yeah, that's in general, I think the idea about around having a license is a good idea. I think that as long as that's not what drives the profession. And what drives the profession is our ability to be able to kind of get out of our own skin and understand how we can impact things at a larger scale than just what we know and what we've done for the last 100 or 200 years. Because the licensure is important because it sets a standard of how we can, I think, protect a community and things like life safety are incredibly important. So I think that has its value, but it shouldn't be the flag bearer of the profession.
Exactly, and while you dropped out, we were talking about other professions, attorneys and doctors who are licensed, and it doesn't having a license doesn't necessarily mean you're good at what you do, right?
Absolutely not.
But you're right. Maybe it is. Maybe we are the profession that is stuck on this term architect because I don't hear attorneys or lawyers battling or doctors. I mean, I don't read about it. I mean, there's Dr. Dre. Nobody's after Dr. Dre. He's been using Dr. Dre, for years. And Dr. Phil. I mean, I guess I don't know. I'll leave that. But so people are using the terms, and I don't see that community, getting in an upheaval like we seem to do.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I also think that, when you think about those other communities, there's a certain, I think that our profession has a certain level of insecurity about it, and those other professions do not. I think that they're more interested in their contribution to whatever they're working on, regardless of your personal feelings about attorneys or doctors. I think that their focus is much more about their personal practice than it is about what other people are saying about it.
Although it'd be interesting. Not only that. Oh, go ahead, Eric. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say. First of all, doctors and attorneys are too busy making money and being confident about their success to worry about such trivial matters. But also, you've got different types of doctors, right? My father was a surgeon for 40 years. He was a podiatric surgeon. He only worked on feet, right? But he called himself a doctor, even though he couldn't work above anything above the knee legally. I mean, that's the way it works, right? A heart surgeon can't treat you for can't treat you for a brain surgery. So they understand the subtle difference, but yet we go to them, know that they're licensed, and anybody and trust that anybody who would be out there calling themselves a doctor that wasn't would end up in jail, and individual doctors don't stress about all that.
You're right. That is a good point. That they're not worried about what their peers are doing in the way that maybe we as architects seem to think, like, oh, that person's not licensed, he shouldn't be doing that. Like, they don't have those conversations. Stephen, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just had the thought that I wonder, and it would be interesting to track potentially a parallel profession as our model of care changes in the healthcare world. I actually wonder if doctors don't start to have some of the same discussions that we're having, meaning there are a lot of outpatient clinics certainly popping up everywhere, and our care model is becoming much more focused on ambulatory care. I actually wonder if that doesn't become an issue, sort of, and you can see the tension potentially building between nurses and doctors and how those interact and what sort of value they provide to the patients. You wonder if it'll be interesting to watch over the next few years if that becomes a parallel discussion.
Let's see. I guess I know some of you were on your lunch hour and we're at 1 o'clock. Is there anything else that anybody wants to add? Or actually, let me go through each of you for a final thought. Why don't we do that? So, Brandon, let's start with you first. Final thought.
Yeah, I guess my final thought would be I think that we should encourage folks to widen their gaze and think about our ability and the way we've been trained is really unique. If you think about it, I think that Bruce Mao had some stat like 1% of the world's population has a college degree. So if you slice that pie even further and think about what the percentage of the world is that has a design degree and has the ability to think about problems in the complex way that we do, we should be really thinking about, some really small percentage of people have the ability to affect a great amount of change. So thinking about how we can better plug into the global community and how we can help progress the world in a way that can bring design to more people is, I think, obviously to me, way more interesting and exciting than worrying about whether I'm called an architect, a designer, a duck. I don't care what they call me as long as I'm participating in that process. I think we're going to be moving the world along a lot better than worrying about these types of things. Eric, over to you.
Yeah, I agree with Brandon. I'm just happy that they call me at all, right? So I think if we spent the energy on regulating the term architect and instead focused on teaching the public the value of design, the value of what we do, and why we're needed on the job, and how we can save our clients money, I think we'd all be better off. And let the thing regulate itself. These enforcement actions that I joke about, they always come after the fact. They always come after the person has illegally stamped the drawings. So the damage is already being done anyway. So you're not helping the profession by doing this. Let's instead focus on teaching people that we as architects are actually needed and useful, and not essentially push ourselves into oblivion.
Evan.
Yeah, I think that if the way I think about architecture is this giant family tree, and so, we think back to the 20s and 30s and we think about, one or two architects or three architects that we know, and now, we're where we are and we know a lot more architects by name. And it seems like every generation there's like this hard line between the previous generation and the next generation, and we're fighting this battle with the unlicensed or the people who are outside the walls of architecture, but it's also affecting the people who are inside the walls of architecture, and it's creating rifts everywhere. It's not just between licensed and unlicensed, but it's between students and the profession. It's between potential owners of projects and the profession. These things are happening everywhere, and instead of creating those rifts, I feel like all of our energy needs to be focused on what Eric and what Brandon were saying, teaching people, showing people what we know, showing them why what we know is so important and what it can do for them. And I feel like if the more we teach people, the more that we are like the Food Network and we show everybody how to bake the cake, it's going to open up the exposure that we need to not only just plead with people that were relevant, but to show them why.
And Stephen.
Yeah, so I've enjoyed this discussion tremendously, and I'm happy to say that I leave this discussion more optimistic than when I came. So I'm tremendously happy about that. I think, my last thought is that I do think architects have a lot to offer to the world. I think that the value we provide is there, and if we can develop the confidence that that's true, I think we have a lot to offer. I'd also say that we've got to stop moving away from our ability to design and do great design. I think we've got to be willing to embrace that as the world embraces design and realizes that it's an important part of how we live, and the sooner we do that, I think the more value we'll be able to provide to our clients and to the world generally.
Alrighty, all of you guys said really great closing things. You're very articulate. Architects are smart.
Yes, we are.
All right, guys, I want to...
I think you mean architects.
Yeah, exactly. All right, guys, I want to thank you guys for joining me. I'm sure we'll talk again on behalf of our panelists, Brandon, Eric, Evan, and Stephen. My name is David Doucette, and we will see you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the ARE Podcast. Be sure to visit architectexamprep.com and check out our other podcast episodes, video tips, and the ARE blog. Remember to plan, practice, and pass.